The hospital room was silent except for the steady beeping of machines monitoring her broken body. Sarah Mitchell stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny holes in each square to keep her mind off the crushing reality that her right arm would never be the same. 3 surgeries, 17 screws, and 2 metal plates later, the doctors had done everything they could. But they couldn't give her back what mattered most, her ability to serve as a Navy SEAL. The accident wasn't supposed to happen. Elite warriors don't get taken down by drunk drivers on quiet suburban streets. They don't end up in hospital beds, facing medical boards that will decide their military fate. They certainly don't cry in the darkness when they think no one is watching. But Sarah Mitchell was about to prove that what breaks you doesn't define you. What happens next would rewrite everything the Navy thought they knew about human resilience, adaptation, and the true meaning of never giving up. Her journey from that hospital bed to making history would inspire a generation and force an entire military branch to reconsider what makes someone truly unstoppable. This is the story of how a shattered arm became the foundation for an unshakable spirit, and how one woman's refusal to accept defeat changed not just her own life, but the lives of every person who said it couldn't be done. Sarah Mitchell had always been different. Growing up in the small town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, she was the girl who climbed the highest trees, jumped off the tallest rocks in a quarry, and never backed down from a challenge. While other kids complained about chores, she volunteered for the hardest jobs on her family's farm. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, recognized something special in his youngest daughter, a fire that burned brighter than fear. The day she announced her intention to join the Navy SEALs, the family dinner table went quiet. Her mother set down her fork and stared at her 17-year-old daughter as if seeing her for the first time. Her older brothers exchanged glances that mixed disbelief with something that might have been respect. Her father simply nodded, as if he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. "The SEALs don't take women," her mother said finally, her voice gentle but firm. Sarah's jaw tightened. "They will." That determination had carried her through 4 years at the Naval Academy, where she graduated third in her class while maintaining a punishing physical training schedule that left her roommates exhausted just watching. It sustained her through the grueling months of basic underwater demolition training, where she was one of only 3 women in a class of 240 men. When her first attempt ended in injury, a stress fracture that forced her out in week 14, she refused medical discharge and came back stronger. The second time, she made it through. Not just made it, she excelled. Her instructors, initially skeptical about training women for the teams, found themselves studying her techniques. Sarah had learned to work with her body's natural advantages rather than against its limitations. Where the men relied on pure strength, she developed leverage and technique that often proved more effective. Her swimming times consistently ranked in the top 10%. Her marksmanship was legendary. By age 26, Petty Officer First Class Sarah Mitchell had completed 3 deployments in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. She had earned the respect of teammates who initially questioned whether a woman belonged on their squad. Her call sign, Ghost, came from her uncanny ability to move through hostile territory undetected, gathering intelligence that had prevented countless attacks on American forces. But on a quiet Tuesday evening in Virginia Beach, none of that mattered. Sarah was walking back from the grocery store, carrying a bag of ingredients for the dinner she planned to cook for her boyfriend Marcus, also a SEAL, who was returning from a 6-month deployment the next day. She was thinking about the surprise party his teammates were planning, mentally rehearsing the speech she wanted to give about how proud she was of his service. The crosswalk light turned green, and she stepped into the intersection. She never saw the pickup truck. The driver, later identified as 23-year-old Derek Hastings, had spent the evening at 3 different bars celebrating what he called his freedom after losing his job at a construction company. His blood alcohol level was nearly 3 times the legal limit when he ran the red light at 45 miles per hour. Security cameras would later show that he never even attempted to brake. Sarah's last clear memory was the sensation of flying. Not the controlled flight of a parachute jump, but something chaotic and wrong. Then, darkness. She woke up 36 hours later to the sound of her mother crying. The hospital room was filled with flowers, cards, and fellow SEALs standing at respectful attention around her bed. Her commanding officer, Captain James Rodriguez, stepped forward when he saw her eyes focus. "How do you feel, Mitchell?" Sarah tried to answer, but her throat was raw from the breathing tube. She tried to gesture, and that's when the reality hit her like a second collision. Her right arm, her shooting arm, her climbing arm, the arm that had pulled countless teammates to safety, was immobilized in a complex external fixation device that looked more like medieval torture equipment than modern medicine. Dr. Amanda Chun, the orthopedic surgeon who had worked on her for 7 hours, explained the damage in clinical terms that felt like another kind of assault. Multiple compound fractures of the radius and ulna, severe damage to the radial nerve, torn ligaments throughout the elbow joint, bone fragments that had been too damaged to save. "We saved the arm," Dr. Chun said, her voice gentle but professional. "But the function will be significantly impaired. You'll have maybe 60% mobility once the healing is complete. The nerve damage means limited fine motor control. I'm sorry, but your military career is effectively over." The room fell silent. Sarah stared at the ceiling, processing words that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Around her bed, she could feel the weight of her teammates' sorrow, their understanding of what this meant. A SEAL who couldn't shoot, couldn't climb, couldn't perform the precise physical tasks their missions demanded wasn't really a SEAL at all. Marcus arrived that afternoon, still wearing his dusty uniform from the transport flight. He sat beside her bed and held her uninjured hand without saying a word. She could see him struggling with his own emotions, relief that she was alive, anger at the drunk driver, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Later, she would recognize it as fear. Not fear for her physical recovery, but fear of watching the strongest person he knew confront something that couldn't be defeated through willpower and training. The next few weeks blurred together in a haze of surgery, physical therapy, and difficult conversations with military medical boards. The external fixator came off, replaced by a heavy cast that seemed to weigh more than her full combat gear. Physical therapists worked patiently with her, celebrating small victories like being able to bend her elbow 30 degrees or grip a rubber ball. But Sarah knew what everyone else was thinking. The same question appeared in the careful way people looked at her, in a hesitation before they spoke, in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. The unspoken question that hung over everything. What does a broken Navy SEAL do with the rest of her life? 3 months after the accident, Sarah sat in Captain Rodriguez's office for what she knew would be their final meeting as commanding officer and subordinate. The medical board had completed their evaluation. The conclusion was exactly what everyone expected. "Mitchell, you know I've never seen a better SEAL," Captain Rodriguez began, his voice heavy with regret. "Your service record is exemplary. Your teammates would follow you anywhere, and that's the highest praise I can give any operator." Sarah waited for the but that she knew was coming. "But the medical board's decision is final. You're being medically retired with full honors. Your disability rating entitles you to full benefits, and I've personally written recommendations for any civilian position you might want to pursue." Defense contractors are always looking for people with your experience and clearance level. Sarah looked down at her right arm, now free of the cast, but visibly altered. The scars from surgery created an abstract pattern across her forearm. Her hand, once steady enough to thread a needle while rappelling down a cliff face, trembled slightly when she tried to make a fist. The doctors had been right about the 60% mobility on good days. On bad days, when the weather changed or she pushed too hard in physical therapy, it was more like 40%. Permission to speak freely, sir? Always. This isn't over. Captain Rodriguez studied her face, seeing something there that made him lean back in his chair. Sarah, I understand this is difficult to accept, but no, sir. You misunderstand. I'm not talking about appealing the medical board's decision. I'm talking about proving them wrong. What do you mean? Sarah stood up, unconsciously straightening into the attention position she'd held thousands of times before. I got to figure out how to be a Navy SEAL with one good arm. And then I'm going to show them that the only thing that really matters is what's in here. She tapped her chest with her left hand. The rest is just equipment. Captain Rodriguez had seen that look before, in the eyes of operators who had survived impossible situations through pure determination. But he'd never seen it in the context of someone trying to overcome what the entire military medical establishment considered an insurmountable obstacle. Mitchell, even if that were possible, and I'm not saying it is, the Navy isn't going to change its physical standards for one person. Then I'll exceed them. After she left the captain's office, Sarah drove to the beach where she'd done her morning runs for the past 4 years. The sun was setting over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of the sunsets she'd watched from forward operating bases in Afghanistan. She sat on a piece of driftwood and called Marcus. How did it go? His voice was gentle, prepared for tears or anger or despair. I've been medically retired. I'm sorry, Sarah. I know how much. I'm going to get back. A pause. What do you mean? I'm going to figure out how to be a SEAL again. Different than before, but still a SEAL. Another pause, longer this time. Honey, the doctor said my arm would never be the same. They didn't say my mind would be different. They didn't say my training would disappear. They said I can't do the job the way I used to do it. But maybe there's another way. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a mixture of admiration and concern that would become familiar over the coming months. You're serious about this. Dead serious. It's impossible, Sarah. The physical requirements alone. Marcus, you remember what they told us in training? The only impossible mission is the one you don't prepare for. She could almost hear him thinking through the implications, weighing his love for her against his knowledge of military regulations and physical limitations. Finally, he sighed, what do you need me to do? That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and began making lists. On the left side, she wrote everything she could no longer do with her injured arm. The list was longer and more depressing than she'd expected. Push-ups, rope climbing, precision shooting with a rifle, operating certain weapon systems, carrying a full combat load, the fundamental movements that define military readiness. On the right side, she began writing everything she could still do. Swimming, running, navigation, languages. She was fluent in Pashto and Arabic. Intelligence analysis, strategy, leadership, the mental aspects that had always been her strongest tools. In the middle of the page, she drew a line and wrote a single word, adapt. The idea that would change everything came to her at 3 in the morning, during one of the sleepless nights that had become routine since the accident. She was researching disabled athletes who had found ways to excel in their sports despite physical limitations. She read about Paralympic shooters who competed with one arm, using specialized equipment and modified techniques. She studied videos of Paralympic swimmers whose times rivaled those of Olympic athletes. But what captured her attention was a documentary about a rock climber who had lost his arm in a climbing accident and returned to climb routes rated more difficult than anything he'd attempted with both arms. The key wasn't trying to climb the same way with less equipment. The key was developing an entirely new approach that turned his limitation into an advantage. Sarah closed the laptop and stared out her window at the pre-dawn darkness. Somewhere out there, drunk drivers were still getting behind the wheel. Terrorists were still planning attacks on American interests. Service members were still deploying to dangerous places where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. The world still needed protectors. Maybe it was time to redefine what a protector could look like. The next morning, she called Captain Rodriguez. "Sir, I'd like to request permission to attempt requalification for active duty." "Mitchell, we've been through this. The medical board's decision is final." "I understand that, sir. But I'd like to challenge the physical fitness standards that led to that decision." A long pause. "Explain." "I want to prove that I can meet or exceed the current SEAL physical fitness requirements using adaptive techniques. If I can do that, I want the opportunity to demonstrate that those techniques can be effective in operational scenarios." "Sarah, even if you could somehow pass the physical tests, which the medical experts say is impossible, there's no precedent for what you're suggesting." "Sir, there was no precedent for women in the SEALs until there was." Another pause, longer this time. When Captain Rodriguez spoke again, his voice carried a note of curiosity that hadn't been there before. "What exactly are you proposing?" Sarah took a deep breath. The plan she was about to outline had been forming in her mind for weeks, but she'd never spoken it aloud before. Saying it would make it real would commit her to a path that might end in public failure and professional humiliation. "I want 6 months to develop and perfect adaptive techniques for every aspect of SEAL training. Physical fitness, weapons handling, combat operations, everything. Then, I want to attempt the full requalification course. If I fail, I'll accept the medical retirement and never bring this up again. If I succeed, I want full reinstatement to active duty. And if the Navy says no to this whole idea," Sarah smiled for the first time in months, "then I'll find another way to serve. But I'm going to prove this is possible, whether the Navy wants to watch or not." Captain Rodriguez's answer came 3 days later in the form of an official letter that would have crushed most people's dreams before they began. The Navy's position was clear. Current regulations prohibited the accommodation Sarah was requesting. Physical standards existed for operational necessity, not arbitrary discrimination. Medical retirement was the appropriate and final resolution to her situation. But buried in the 4th paragraph was a single sentence that changed everything. However, the Navy remains committed to evidence-based policy decisions and would review any documented proof of operational capability that challenges current medical assessments. Sarah read that sentence 17 times before calling her father. "They didn't say no," she told him, her voice shaking with excitement and terror in equal measure. "They didn't say yes either, sweetheart. They said they'd look at evidence. Dad, that's all I need. A chance to prove it's possible." Her father was quiet for a moment. "You know this is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done." "Good. Hard things are worth doing." The next morning, Sarah began the most intensive training regimen of her life. But this wasn't the kind of training she'd done before. This was adaptation training, rehabilitation training, and invention training all rolled into one. She started with the basics. How do you do a proper push-up when one arm can only support 60% of normal load? The answer, she discovered, wasn't to do easier push-ups. The answer was to redesign the movement entirely. Working with Dr. Michael Torres, a sports medicine specialist who had worked with Paralympic athletes, Sarah learned to distribute load differently across her body. Instead of relying on bilateral arm strength, she developed techniques that engaged her core, legs, and uninjured arm in ways that actually generated more total power than her old method. It's like learning to walk again, Dr. Torres explained during one of their sessions. Your brain has to create entirely new neural pathways. The advantage is that when those pathways are fully developed, they're often more efficient than the original ones. Swimming presented different challenges. Sarah had always been a strong swimmer, but her stroke technique relied on synchronized arm movement that was now impossible. She spent hours in the pool with Maria Santos, a Paralympic swimming coach, learning to generate propulsion through timing and technique rather than pure strength. "Watch this," Maria said, showing Sarah video of a one-armed swimmer who held world records in 3 events. "See how she uses the water differently? She's not fighting against her limitation. She's using it to create advantages that two-armed swimmers don't have." The breakthrough came when Sarah stopped trying to swim the way she used to and started swimming the way her body worked now. Her new stroke was asymmetrical but incredibly efficient. By month 2 of training, her times were within 5% of her pre-accident performance. Weapons training was the biggest challenge. The Navy's marksmanship standards assumed two-handed shooting with precise bilateral control. Sarah's right hand could hold a weapon, but fine motor control was inconsistent, and the strength to manage recoil was severely limited. She found help from an unexpected source. Jake Morrison, a former Marine sniper who had lost his right arm to an IED in Afghanistan, and now worked as a civilian firearms instructor for disabled veterans. "Everyone thinks shooting is about the arms," Jake told her during their first session. "That's amateur thinking. Shooting is about breathing, balance, and trigger control. The arms are just the delivery system." Jake taught her shooting techniques that leveraged her core strength and natural stability. She learned to use specialized equipment, bipods, slings, and supports that were actually more accurate than traditional two-handed methods for certain types of shots. Her scores weren't just competitive. They were often superior to her pre-accident performance. "You're thinking differently now," Jake observed after a particularly impressive session. "Before, you were a good shooter using conventional methods. Now you're becoming an exceptional shooter using unconventional methods. That's actually more valuable in the field." Physical training became an exercise in creativity and persistence. Sarah couldn't do traditional pull-ups, so she developed alternative movements that worked the same muscle groups while actually improving her grip strength and shoulder stability. She couldn't carry equipment the same way, so she learned distribution techniques that were more efficient and caused less fatigue. Every day brought new problems to solve. How do you rappel with limited grip strength in one hand? How do you perform medical procedures when fine motor control is compromised? How do you handle close-quarters combat when traditional grappling techniques are impossible? For each challenge, Sarah found answers that surprised even her instructors. Working with Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Kim, a hand-to-hand combat instructor, she developed fighting techniques that turned her limitation into an advantage. "Your opponents will expect certain movements," Master Chief Kim explained. "When you can't do what they expect, you become unpredictable. Unpredictable fighters are dangerous fighters." Sarah's new fighting style was unconventional, but devastatingly effective. She learned to use leverage, timing, and positioning to overcome opponents who were stronger than her. In sparring matches, she found herself winning against partners who could easily defeat her using traditional techniques. But the physical training was only part of the challenge. Sarah also had to prepare for the skepticism and doubt that would greet her attempt to return to active duty. Every workout was filmed and documented. Every improvement was measured and recorded. She was building not just physical capability, but a legal case for her reinstatement. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a sports psychologist who worked with elite athletes, helped Sarah prepare for the mental challenges ahead. "You're not just trying to prove you could do the job," Dr. Walsh explained. "You're trying to change how an entire institution thinks about capability and limitation. That's going to create resistance that has nothing to do with your actual performance." The resistance came sooner than expected. Word of Sarah's training had spread through the SEAL community, creating a divide between those who supported her effort and those who saw it as a dangerous precedent. "She's putting other operators at risk," said one anonymous comment on a military forum. "If she can't perform at 100%, she's a liability in the field." But support came from unexpected places. Admiral Patricia Hayes, the highest-ranking woman in Navy Special Operations, requested a meeting with Sarah after hearing about her training program. "I've been watching your progress," Admiral Hayes said during their private conversation. "What you're attempting is unprecedented, and that scares a lot of people." "Yes, ma'am. It should scare you too. But fear of change has held this organization back before. If you can prove this is possible, you'll be opening doors for future generations of service members who might face similar challenges." The Admiral's support came with a warning. "This is going to be the most scrutinized attempt at military requalification in Navy history. Every exercise will be examined. Every measurement will be questioned. You need to be not just as good as other SEALs. You need to be better." By month 4 of training, Sarah was ready for her first official assessment. The Navy had agreed to allow an independent medical board to evaluate her progress, though they made no commitments about what the results would mean for her career. The assessment took place at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, the same facility where she had completed her original SEAL training. The irony wasn't lost on her, as she prepared to prove herself all over again at the place where she'd first earned the right to call herself a special operator. The medical board consisted of 3 physicians, 2 Navy psychologists, and a master chief petty officer who would evaluate her performance on practical military tasks. Dr. Chun, the surgeon who had operated on her arm, was among the evaluators. "I want you to know," Dr. Chun said privately before the assessment began, "that I hope I was wrong about your prognosis. But my job here is to determine whether you pose a risk to yourself or others in operational situations." The physical testing began with standard fitness assessments: push-ups, sit-ups, running, swimming. Sarah's scores weren't just competitive. They exceeded the minimum requirements for SEAL qualification in every category. But the real test came with practical exercises. Combat scenarios where she had to navigate obstacles, engage targets, and perform rescue operations under time pressure and stress. The rope climbing exercise was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Traditional rope climbing required bilateral upper body strength that Sarah clearly didn't possess. The evaluators watched as she approached the rope using techniques that no one in the room had seen before. Instead of the traditional hand-over-hand method, Sarah had developed a technique that used her legs and core strength while her arms provided guidance and stability. She scaled the 30-foot rope in a time that placed her in the top 20% of all SEAL candidates. Master Chief Kim, observing the evaluation, made a note that would later appear in the official report. "Candidate demonstrates superior problem-solving ability and adaptation under pressure." Her unconventional techniques may actually provide tactical advantages in certain operational scenarios. The weapons assessment was equally impressive. Sarah's shooting scores with both rifle and pistol exceeded Navy standards. Her technique was different, but her accuracy was undeniable. More importantly, her ability to transition between targets and engage multiple threats showed that her adaptations didn't compromise operational effectiveness. The final exercise was a simulated rescue scenario where Sarah had to navigate through obstacles, engage hostile targets, and evacuate a wounded teammate. This was the test that would determine whether her adaptations could work in real-world operational conditions. Sarah completed the course in a time that ranked in the top 15% of all SEAL candidates. But more than the numbers, it was her performance under pressure that impressed the evaluators. When equipment malfunctioned, when obstacles required improvised solutions, when split-second decisions meant success or failure, she performed with the calm competence that defined elite operators. Dr. Chin approached Sarah after the evaluation concluded. "I owe you an apology," she said. "When I told you your military career was over, I was applying conventional thinking to an unconventional person. What you've accomplished here challenges everything we thought we knew about adaptation and recovery." The official report, released 2 weeks later, contained language that would be quoted in medical journals and military training manuals for years to come. Candidate Mitchell demonstrates that current disability assessments may be inadequate for evaluating operational capability in highly motivated individuals with access to proper adaptive training. But the report also contained a recommendation that terrified Sarah. Further evaluation recommended under actual operational conditions. The Navy was offering her a chance to prove herself in the field. It was everything she'd wanted and everything she'd feared. Success would vindicate her approach and change military policy forever. Failure could cost lives, her own and those of her teammates. Admiral Hayes called her personally with the decision. "Congratulations, Mitchell. You're being offered the chance to return to active duty on a probationary basis. You'll be assigned to a training detachment where your methods can be evaluated under realistic conditions. If you perform successfully, full reinstatement will be considered." "What's the timeline, ma'am?" "You ship out in 2 weeks. And Mitchell, the whole Navy is going to be watching." That night, Sarah sat with Marcus on the same beach where she'd made her decision to fight for reinstatement. 6 months of training had transformed not just her physical capabilities, but her understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked. Sarah looked at her scarred arm, then at the ocean that had been her training ground for so many months. "I don't know if anyone can be ready for something like this, but I know I'm more prepared than I've ever been for anything in my life. What if something goes wrong? Then I'll adapt to that too." As they walked back toward the car, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Jake Morrison. The Marine sniper who had taught her to shoot again saw the news. "Remember what I told you. You're not just a good operator using conventional methods anymore. You're an exceptional operator using unconventional methods. Now go prove it to everyone else." 2 weeks later, Sarah reported to Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the Navy's premier special operations unit, for what everyone understood would be the ultimate test of whether a broken SEAL could be rebuilt into something stronger than before. Naval Special Warfare Development Group, known simply as DevGru among those with the clearance to know it existed, occupied a sprawling complex in Virginia that looked more like a college campus than the headquarters of the Navy's most elite special operations unit. Sarah arrived on a humid Monday morning in August, carrying the same sea bag she'd used as a recruit, but feeling like an entirely different person than the woman who had packed it 6 months earlier. Commander David Park, the officer who would oversee her probationary period, met her at the security checkpoint. He was younger than she'd expected, with the lean build and quiet intensity that mark career special operators. His handshake was firm but measured, as if he were already evaluating her capabilities. "Welcome back to active duty, Mitchell," he said, leading her through corridors lined with photographs of operations that officially never happened. "I'll be honest with you. Half the people here think this is a publicity stunt that's going to get someone killed. The other half think you might be onto something revolutionary. My job is to figure out which half is right." The briefing room where Commander Park explained her assignment was filled with charts, satellite photos, and classified documents that Sarah recognized from her previous deployments. But the mission he outlined was unlike anything she'd encountered before. "We've been tasked with developing new techniques for operating in environments where conventional special operations methods are compromised," Commander Park explained. "Urban settings where stealth and adaptability matter more than overwhelming firepower. Situations where thinking differently isn't just an advantage. It's the only way to succeed." Sarah studied the mission parameters, recognizing immediately what wasn't being said directly. The Navy wasn't just evaluating whether she could perform as a disabled operator. They were testing whether her adaptive techniques could solve problems that conventional operators couldn't handle. "This is about more than just my reinstatement," she said. "Much more. The nature of warfare is changing. We need operators who can adapt to circumstances we haven't even imagined yet. Your situation has forced you to develop exactly those kinds of skills." Her first assignment was to join a team conducting surveillance exercises in an urban environment that simulated Middle Eastern cities where American forces frequently operated. The scenario involved gathering intelligence on suspected terrorist activities while remaining undetected in a hostile population. Team leader Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres introduced her to the rest of the squad, 8 experienced operators who had collectively completed dozens of overseas deployments. Their reception was polite, but reserved. Sarah could sense them watching her movements, cataloging every adaptation she'd made, wondering whether her presence would compromise their effectiveness. "Mitchell will be taking point on surveillance operations," Commander Torres announced. "Her profile and movement techniques may be less conspicuous in certain situations." Petty Officer First Class Tommy Chun, a sniper with 6 deployments under his belt, raised an eyebrow. "No disrespect, but how does someone with limited mobility take point on surveillance?" It was a fair question, and Sarah had been expecting it. Because sometimes the best way to move undetected is to not move like a soldier. The exercise took place in a mock city built for military training, complete with civilian role players who had been instructed to identify and report military personnel they spotted. The mission was to establish observation posts in 3 separate buildings and maintain surveillance on a target location for 72 hours without being detected. Sarah's approach to the mission was fundamentally different from traditional special operations methods. Instead of relying on physical stealth and rapid movement, she used social camouflage and psychological misdirection. Her limited arm mobility, rather than being a hindrance, became part of a cover identity that made her nearly invisible to the role players. Posing as a woman recovering from an accident, Sarah moved through the urban environment with a natural explanation for her careful movements and modified behaviors. She established observation posts in locations that conventional thinking would never consider. A physical therapy clinic with windows overlooking the target. A cafe where her presence reading magazines appeared perfectly normal. Even a bus stop where she could maintain hours of surveillance while appearing to wait for transportation. The genius of her approach became apparent during the first night of the exercise. While the rest of her team remained hidden in traditional concealment, Sarah sat in a 24-hour laundromat across from the Target building, washing clothes and reading a book while maintaining perfect surveillance through windows that conventional operators couldn't access without exposing themselves. She's been sitting there for 6 hours, Tommy Chun reported through his radio. No one's given her a second look. Because no one suspects a disabled woman of being a military operator, Commander Torres replied. It's invisible in plain sight. But the real test came when the exercise shifted to active operations. Intelligence gathered during surveillance indicated that the simulated terrorists were planning to move weapons through the area. Sarah's team was tasked with interdicting the operation while maintaining plausible deniability about American involvement. Traditional special operations doctrine would have called for a direct action mission. Fast insertion, overwhelming force, rapid extraction. But the parameters of the exercise made such an approach impossible. Too many civilian witnesses, too much risk of international incident, too many variables that conventional tactics couldn't address. Sarah proposed an alternative that initially struck her teammates as impossible. We don't intercept the weapons, she explained during mission planning. We make them intercept themselves. Her plan involved using the urban environment and civilian population as force multipliers. Instead of engaging the targets directly, they would manipulate circumstances to create a situation where local security forces would discover the weapons operation naturally. It's not about what we can do, Sarah explained. It's about what we can make happen. The operation required precise timing, extensive coordination, and the kind of adaptive thinking that conventional military training didn't emphasize. Sarah's role was to position herself as a seemingly innocent witness who would provide the trigger for local police involvement at exactly the right moment. At 0300 hours on the second night of the exercise, Sarah sat in an all-night diner with a clear view of the alley where the weapons transfer was scheduled to take place. Her teammates were positioned throughout the area, but instead of preparing for direct engagement, they were ready to guide and influence events from the shadows. When the transfer began, Sarah made a phone call to local police, reporting a domestic disturbance in the apartment building next to the alley. The call was timed to ensure police arrival, just as the weapons would be most visible. Meanwhile, her teammates created small disruptions that channeled the police response exactly where it needed to go. The entire operation was over in 15 minutes. Local police discovered the weapons cache and arrested the role players without ever realizing they had been manipulated into doing so. No shots were fired by American forces. No evidence of military involvement remained. The mission objectives were achieved through intelligence and adaptation rather than firepower. I've never seen anything like that, Commander Torres said during the after-action briefing. You turned the entire civilian environment into a weapon system. The success of the urban exercise led to increasingly complex scenarios. Sarah's team was assigned missions that tested the limits of unconventional thinking. Hostage rescues in environments where conventional assault techniques would be suicide, intelligence gathering in situations where normal infiltration methods were impossible, counterterrorism operations that required surgical precision rather than overwhelming force. Each mission revealed new applications for the adaptive techniques Sarah had developed during her recovery. Her limited physical capabilities forced creative solutions that often proved superior to conventional approaches. More importantly, her methods were beginning to influence how her teammates approached their own challenges. She's changing how we think about everything, Petty Officer Chun confided to Commander Torres after a particularly successful mission. I've been doing this for 8 years, and I'm learning things I never considered before. But the real validation came during a joint exercise with International Special Operations Forces. Teams from British SAS, German GE9, and Israeli special forces were participating in a complex counterterrorism scenario that would test the best methods from each unit. The scenario involved a hostage situation in a high-rise building where terrorists had taken control of multiple floors. Each national team was assigned different objectives, but success depended on coordination and avoiding civilian casualties. Traditional assault techniques had been ruled out due to the presence of innocent hostages throughout the building. Sarah's team was assigned the most challenging objective, reaching the top floor where the terrorist leadership was located, while ensuring that their approach didn't trigger execution of hostages being held on lower floors. The solution she proposed was so unconventional that initially, other teams dismissed it as impossible. "You want to go through the building's maintenance systems," the British SAS commander said, reviewing Sarah's plan. "Through areas that weren't designed for human access." "That's exactly right," Sarah replied. "Everyone expects special operations teams to move through spaces designed for people. No one expects us to move through spaces designed for ventilation and utilities." Her approach required specialized equipment and techniques that push the boundaries of what special operators typically train for. Instead of traditional breaching and clearing methods, her team would access the target floor through building systems that terrorists wouldn't think to guard. Sarah's physical limitations actually became advantages in the confined spaces of the building's infrastructure. Her smaller profile and modified movement techniques allowed her to navigate areas that would have been impossible for conventional operators. Her teammates had to learn new skills to follow her route, but the result was access to the target area that completely bypassed terrorist security measures. The exercise culminated in a coordinated assault that neutralized all terrorist threats while saving every hostage. Sarah's team reached their objective undetected, providing intelligence that allowed other teams to time their operations perfectly. "Outstanding work," the Israeli team commander said after the exercise concluded. "Your methods could revolutionize urban operations." But perhaps the most meaningful praise came from Tommy Chun, who had initially questioned whether Sarah belonged on the team. "I owe you an apology," he said privately. "When you first got here, I thought your disability would make you a liability. I was wrong. Your disability made you better." The formal evaluation period concluded with a comprehensive assessment that would determine Sarah's future with the Navy. Commander Park's report summarized months of observations, performance metrics, and mission outcomes. The conclusions would influence not just Sarah's career, but military policy for years to come. Petty Officer Mitchell has demonstrated exceptional operational capability through adaptive techniques that often exceed conventional performance standards, the report concluded. Her methods have proven effective across multiple mission types and have influenced team performance in measurably positive ways. But the report also noted the challenges that remained. Integration of these techniques into broader special operations doctrine will require significant changes in training and equipment standards. The question is not whether these methods work, but whether the Navy is prepared to implement the institutional changes necessary to support them. Admiral Hayes personally delivered the results during a meeting at the Pentagon that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. "Congratulations," the Admiral said, sliding an official document across her desk. "You're being recommended for full reinstatement to active duty status." Sarah stared at the paperwork that officially made her the first disabled Navy SEAL to return to operational status. "What happens now?" "Now you help us figure out how to train the next generation of operators to think the way you do. Your success has opened a door, but someone needs to build the bridge that others can follow." That evening, Sarah called her father from her hotel room in Washington. "I got it, Dad. Full reinstatement. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. But I have to ask, was it worth it? Sarah looked out the window at the lights of the Capitol, thinking about all the people who had said it was impossible, all the barriers that had been overcome, all the future operators who would benefit from the precedent she'd established. Ask me again in 10 years, she said, when we see what this leads to. Sarah's new assignment came with a title that had never existed before in Navy Special Operations, Director of Adaptive Training Development. Her office at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado overlooked the same beach where she had struggled through her original SEAL training, but now she saw it through entirely different eyes. The mandate from Admiral Hayes was ambitious and unprecedented. Develop training protocols that would prepare all special operations personnel for adaptive techniques, identify and recruit candidates who might have been overlooked by traditional selection criteria, and create new operational doctrines that leveraged unconventional approaches to warfare. You're not just changing how disabled operators work, Admiral Hayes explained during Sarah's first briefing in her new role. You're changing how all operators think about capability and limitation. The resistance came immediately and from multiple directions. Traditional training instructors argued that established methods had proven effective for decades. Medical personnel questioned whether encouraging adaptive techniques might increase injury rates. Budget analysts worried about the costs of developing new equipment and modifying existing facilities. Sarah's first meeting with the Coronado training staff felt like facing a hostile tribunal. With respect, said Master Chief Petty Officer James Sullivan, who had overseen SEAL training for 15 years, our job is to prepare operators for life or death situations. We can't afford to experiment with unproven methods. Master Chief, Sarah replied, 6 months ago, you would have said that a SEAL with a disabled arm was an unproven method too. How did that work out? The room fell silent as Sullivan considered the implications. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah's presentation outlined a comprehensive revision of special operations training that incorporated adaptive thinking from the beginning rather than treating it as accommodation for disabled personnel. Her research had shown that operators trained in adaptive techniques from the start were more creative problem solvers, more resilient under stress, and more effective in unconventional scenarios. We're not lowering standards, she explained. We're raising them by teaching people to succeed under any circumstances. The pilot program began with 20 volunteers from incoming SEAL candidates. Half would receive traditional training. Half would be taught using Sarah's adaptive methods. The experiment would measure not just physical performance, but creativity, resilience, and operational effectiveness. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the one-armed Marine sniper who had taught Sarah to shoot again, agreed to help design the curriculum. His military experience, combined with his understanding of adaptive techniques, made him the perfect partner for developing new training methods. The key, Jake explained to the first group of adaptive training candidates, is learning to see limitations as opportunities. Every constraint forces you to think differently, and different thinking leads to better solutions. The first exercise seemed almost cruel to outside observers. Candidates were required to complete obstacle courses while wearing equipment that simulated various disabilities: restricted vision, limited mobility, reduced hearing. The goal wasn't to make them disabled, but to force them to develop alternative approaches when their primary capabilities were compromised. Traditional candidates struggled with the modified exercises, often becoming frustrated when conventional techniques didn't work. But the adaptive training group approached each challenge as a puzzle to solve rather than a barrier to overcome. Look at the difference, Sarah observed to Master Chief Sullivan as they watched candidates navigate a rope bridge while wearing gloves that limited their grip strength. The traditional group sees this as unfair. The adaptive group sees it as interesting. The psychological testing revealed even more dramatic differences. Adaptive training candidates showed higher tolerance for ambiguity, greater flexibility in problem solving, and improved performance under stress. They weren't just learning alternative techniques. They were developing different mental frameworks for approaching challenges. But the real proof came during field exercises that simulated actual operational conditions. When equipment failed, when plans didn't work, when circumstances required immediate adaptation, the candidates trained in Sarah's methods consistently outperformed their traditionally trained counterparts. "It's not even close," reported Commander Torres, who had overseen both training groups during a complex urban warfare exercise. The adaptive group doesn't just handle unexpected problems better. They seem to anticipate them. Word of the training program's success spread throughout the special operations community, attracting attention from unexpected sources. The Army's Special Forces, the Air Force's pararescue teams, and even CIA operatives requested briefings on adaptive training techniques. Dr. Lisa Wong, a Pentagon researcher studying military performance enhancement, spent 3 months at Coronado evaluating Sarah's methods. "What you've developed here goes beyond disability accommodation," Dr. Wong told Sarah during her final briefing. "You've created a new paradigm for elite military training that could revolutionize special operations across all services." The success brought new challenges. Sarah found herself traveling constantly, briefing senior military leaders, consulting with training facilities, and presenting her methods to increasingly high-level audiences. Each presentation was an opportunity to expand adaptive training, but also a test of whether the military establishment was ready for such fundamental changes. The breakthrough came during a joint training exercise with International Special Operations Forces at a facility in Germany. Teams from 12 different nations were testing new counterterrorism techniques, but the exercise had been designed using traditional operational assumptions. On the second day of training, an unexpected problem emerged. Intelligence indicated that the simulated terrorists had taken hostages in a building that was impossible to assault using conventional methods. Previous exercises had simply declared such scenarios unwinnable and moved on to different objectives. Sarah requested permission to demonstrate an alternative approach using adaptive techniques. The scenario assumes that special operations teams need to enter the building to neutralize threats, she explained to the International Command staff. But what if we could accomplish the mission without entering the building at all? Her proposal seemed impossible to commanders trained in direct action methods. Neutralize all terrorist threats and rescue all hostages without any special operations personnel entering the target building. "How?" asked Colonel Hans Weber, the German G9 commander overseeing the exercise. "By turning the building itself into our weapon system." The operation Sarah designed required 3 days of preparation and coordination between multiple agencies that had never worked together before. Her team would manipulate building systems, emergency services, and even news media to create a situation where the terrorists would be forced to surrender without any shots being fired. "This is either brilliant or completely insane," observed Major Sarah Chun from the British SAS, watching Sarah's team prepare equipment that looked more like computer hardware than military gear. The operation began at dawn with what appeared to be a routine city inspection of the building's emergency systems. Sarah's team, posing as municipal employees, gained access to utility areas and began implementing modifications that would give them control of lighting, climate, and communication systems throughout the structure. Simultaneously, other team members working with local police created a carefully orchestrated series of events that would isolate the building and establish perimeter security without the terrorists realizing they were under siege. The beauty of this approach, Sarah explained to the watching commanders, is that from the terrorist perspective, everything looks like normal bureaucratic incompetence. They don't realize they're being tactically maneuvered until it's too late to respond. Over the course of 8 hours, Sarah's team systematically degraded the terrorists' capabilities without their knowledge. Power fluctuations disrupted their communications. Climate control malfunctions made parts of the building uncomfortable. Small municipal problems created stress and confusion that undermined their operational planning. The psychological pressure was applied so gradually that the terrorists didn't recognize it as an attack. When local news media, actually undercover operators, began reporting on building safety violations that required immediate evacuation, the terrorists found themselves facing a choice between maintaining their hostages and avoiding what appeared to be legitimate legal troubles. They're starting to argue among themselves, reported an operative monitoring communications from the building. The psychological pressure is fragmenting their group cohesion. The operation concluded when building management, more undercover operators, announced that emergency repairs required immediate evacuation of all occupants. Faced with what seemed like routine municipal authority rather than military opposition, the terrorists surrendered their hostages and attempted to blend in with evacuating civilians. They were quietly arrested by plainclothes police as they left the building, never realizing they had been outmaneuvered by special operations forces they never saw. Extraordinary, Colonel Weber said as he reviewed the operation's results. 0 casualties, complete mission success, and no indication of military involvement. How is this possible? Because we changed the rules, Sarah replied. Instead of fighting the battle they expected, we created a different battle entirely. The German exercise became a case study that was classified and distributed throughout NATO Special Operations Commands. Sarah's adaptive methods weren't just proving effective in American training scenarios. They were demonstrating universal applications that could change how elite military units operated worldwide. But success brought unexpected complications. As Sarah's reputation grew, so did the scrutiny of her personal story. Media attention that she had carefully avoided during her recovery began to find her through military channels. Requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and book deals arrived weekly. "You're becoming a symbol," Admiral Hayes warned during one of their regular meetings. "That comes with benefits and risks." The risks became apparent when a national news magazine published a profile of Sarah that focused more on her disability than her accomplishments. The article, titled "The Disabled Navy SEAL Who Changed Everything," emphasized her personal struggle over her professional innovations. "They're missing the point," Sarah complained to Marcus over dinner that night. "This isn't about disability. It's about adaptation. It's about thinking differently." "Maybe that's your fault," Marcus suggested gently. "What do you mean? You've been so focused on proving you could overcome your disability that you haven't spent enough time explaining why your methods work for everyone." The criticism stung because it was accurate. Sarah realized she had been so determined to prove that disabled personnel could be effective operators that she had undersold the broader applications of adaptive training for all military personnel. Her response was to request a presentation opportunity that would reach the highest levels of military leadership. The annual Special Operations Commanders Conference, where the leaders of every elite military unit in America gathered to discuss strategy and innovation. "I want to brief them on adaptive operations doctrine," she told Admiral Hayes. "Not as disability accommodation, but as evolution in military thinking." That's a room full of generals and admirals who have built their careers on conventional military success. You're asking them to consider fundamental changes to methods that have worked for generations. Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what I'm asking. The conference was held at a secure facility outside Washington, bringing together 300 of the most senior special operations leaders in the American military. Sarah's presentation was scheduled for the final day. After technical briefings on new equipment, intelligence assessments of emerging threats, and strategic discussions of future operational requirements. She entered the auditorium knowing that the next 30 minutes would determine not just the future of adaptive training, but the legacy of everything she had worked to accomplish since her accident. "Good morning," she began, looking out at an audience of officers who collectively commanded tens of thousands of elite personnel. 2 years ago, most of you would have said that a disabled Navy SEAL was a contradiction in terms. Today, I'm here to explain why you were right, and why that's the point. The auditorium was silent as Sarah clicked to her first slide, showing video footage from the German exercise where her team had accomplished the impossible mission without firing a shot. She could see skepticism in the faces of generals who had built their careers on decisive military action. But she also saw curiosity in the eyes of commanders who understood that warfare was evolving faster than traditional doctrine. "Special operations have always been about doing what others can't," Sarah continued. "But we've defined can't too narrowly. We've assumed that elite performance requires perfect physical capability, conventional training methods, and standardized approaches to problem solving. The future of warfare will require us to think differently." She clicked to the next slide, showing performance statistics from adaptive training graduates compared to traditional candidates. The numbers were striking. Adaptive trainees showed superior performance in unconventional scenarios, higher resilience under stress, and better problem-solving capabilities when standard procedures failed. "These aren't disabled operators performing as well as normal ones," Sarah explained. "These are operators trained to adapt, performing better than operators trained to conform." General Patricia Morgan, commander of Army Special Operations, raised her hand. "Mitchell, your personal story is inspiring, but how do we know these results can be scaled? You're talking about changing training protocols that have produced successful operators for decades." It was the question Sarah had been preparing for since she'd started this journey. "General, 3 years ago, I couldn't do a single push-up the way I've been trained to do them. Today, I can do more push-ups than I could before my accident, using techniques that engage my entire body more effectively. The limitation forced innovation that created superior capability. That principle applies beyond individual disability." She clicked to a video showing adaptive training candidates completing obstacle courses that have been impossible using conventional methods. Instead of standardized approaches, each operator had developed personalized techniques that leveraged their individual strengths while compensating for various artificially imposed limitations. "We're not teaching people to overcome disabilities," Sarah explained. "We're teaching them to transcend limitations. Every operator has limitations: physical, mental, technological, tactical. Traditional training tries to minimize those limitations. Adaptive training teaches operators to transform limitations into advantages." Admiral James Richardson, head of Naval Special Warfare Command, leaned forward in his seat. "Give us a concrete example of how this changes operational capability." Sarah had prepared for this moment with a real-world scenario that every commander in the room would recognize. Last month, a joint special operations team in Syria encountered a situation where their primary extraction point had been compromised. Traditional doctrine called for a fighting withdrawal to a secondary location. Instead, the team leader used adaptive principles to turn the compromised situation into an advantage. She clicked to a classified briefing slide that showed the tactical situation. Instead of retreating, They used the enemy's knowledge of their original plan to create a deception operation. They made it appear they were executing a conventional extraction while actually using the enemy's response to gather intelligence on terrorist command structures. What should have been a failed mission became one of the most successful intelligence operations of the year. The room was quiet as commanders processed the implications. Colonel Robert Hayes from Marine Special Operations finally spoke. Who was the team leader on that operation? Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos. She graduated from our first adaptive training class 18 months ago. Sarah clicked to her final slide, which showed a simple statement. The future of special operations isn't about having perfect operators. It's about having operators who can be perfect for any situation. Gentlemen, ladies, Sarah concluded, the threats we face are evolving. Our enemies are adapting faster than our doctrine. We can continue to select and train operators based on 20th century assumptions about what makes someone elite, or we can prepare them for 21st century realities where adaptation is the ultimate force multiplier. The questions that followed were intense and detailed. Commanders wanted to know about costs, implementation timelines, and integration challenges. But beneath the technical discussions, Sarah could sense a fundamental shift in thinking. These leaders weren't asking whether adaptive training was possible. They were asking how quickly they could implement it. General Morgan was the first to commit resources. I want to establish a pilot program for Army Special Forces within 6 months. Admiral Richardson nodded. The Navy will expand the Coronado program and begin training adaptive instructors immediately. One by one, the commanders of America's elite military units committed to incorporating adaptive training principles into their organizations. What had started as Sarah's personal struggle to return to duty was becoming a military-wide transformation. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came after the formal session ended, when a young Air Force captain approached Sarah in the hallway. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you," Captain Vixixens said quietly. "I was medically discharged from pararescue training 2 years ago after a climbing accident damaged my left leg. I've been working as an intelligence analyst, but I thought my special operations career was over." Sarah looked at the young officer's service record, noting excellent performance ratings and specialized skills that would be valuable in unconventional operations. "Have you considered reapplying for special operations training? They told me my injury disqualified me permanently." "They told me the same thing. How would you feel about proving them wrong again?" 6 months later, Captain Shin became the first officer to re-enter Air Force Special Operations through adaptive training protocols. Her success opened pathways for dozens of other personnel who had been written off by traditional medical standards. The program's expansion brought unexpected benefits beyond, including disabled personnel. Adaptive training techniques proved effective for operators recovering from injuries, aging personnel whose physical capabilities were declining, and even traditional candidates who simply learned better through non-standard methods. Dr. Michael Torres, who had worked with Sarah during her initial rehabilitation, published a research paper that was cited throughout military medical literature. Adaptive Training Protocols, Redefining Elite Performance in Special Operations Personnel. What Sarah accomplished went beyond personal recovery, Dr. Torres wrote. She demonstrated that human performance optimization requires reconsidering fundamental assumptions about capability and limitation. Her methods have applications far beyond military special operations. Those applications began appearing in unexpected places. Paralympic training programs adopted military adaptive techniques. Rehabilitation hospitals implemented protocols developed for special operations training. Corporate leadership development programs incorporated lessons about adapting to constraints and turning limitations into advantages. But for Sarah, the most gratifying development was watching the operators she had trained excel in real-world missions. Lieutenant Commander Santos, the team leader whose successful operation in Syria had impressed the Commanders' Conference, sent regular updates on how adaptive techniques were changing special operations culture. The new guys coming through training think differently, Santos reported during one of their monthly calls. They don't see problems, they see puzzles. They don't see obstacles, they see opportunities. It's changing how we approach everything. The cultural shift extended beyond tactical operations. Special operations units began recruiting candidates who had been overlooked by traditional selection criteria. Personnel with unconventional backgrounds, non-standard physical capabilities, and alternative approaches to problem-solving found opportunities that hadn't existed before. Marcus, who had supported Sarah throughout her recovery and return to service, proposed to her on the same beach where she had made her decision to fight for reinstatement. The engagement ring came with a note that read, "You've shown me that the best way to love someone is to help them become more than they thought possible." Their wedding, held at the Naval Academy Chapel where Sarah had first dreamed of becoming a SEAL, brought together an extraordinary gathering of people whose lives had been changed by adaptive training. Disabled veterans who had returned to active duty, traditional operators who had learned new approaches to their profession, military leaders who had reformed institutional thinking, and researchers studying the implications of redefining human performance. Admiral Hayes, who had become both mentor and friend during Sarah's journey, delivered a toast that captured the significance of what had been accomplished. 3 years ago, Sarah Mitchell faced a choice between accepting limitations and transcending them. Her decision to fight for adaptation over accommodation has changed not just her life, but the future of military service. She has shown us that the question isn't what we can't do, it's what we haven't thought to try. But perhaps the most meaningful speech came from Jake Morrison, the one-armed Marine sniper who had taught Sarah to shoot again and become her closest collaborator in developing adaptive training protocols. Sarah asked me once what I missed most about having 2 arms. Jake said, addressing the wedding guests. I told her I missed nothing, because losing my arm taught me things I never would have learned otherwise. Today, thousands of operators are learning those same lessons without having to lose anything first. That's the real victory. Sarah's response speech was brief, but captured the essence of everything she had learned. People ask me if I'm grateful for my accident because it led to all of this. That's the wrong question. I'm grateful for the opportunity to discover that breaking can be the beginning of becoming stronger. Every person in this room has limitations. Every person here has the potential to transform those limitations into advantages. The only question is whether we're brave enough to try. 5 years after her accident, Sarah received notification that she had been selected for promotion to lieutenant commander and assignment as the first director of adaptive operations doctrine of the Pentagon. Her mandate was to oversee the integration of adaptive training principles across all branches of the military. The formal ceremony took place in the same hospital room where she had first learned that her military career was supposedly over. Dr. Amanda Chun, the surgeon who had told her that her service was finished, was among the guests who watched her receive her new rank. "I owe you more than an apology," Dr. Chun said afterward. "I owe you thanks for teaching me that medical prognosis isn't the same as human potential." Sarah's final words at the ceremony reflected the journey that had brought her from broken SEAL to military innovator. "We gather here where my old life ended and my new one began. I learned in this room that what we call disability is often just a different way of being capable. What we call limitation is often just an invitation to innovation. What we call impossible is often just untested. The program she had created continued growing long after her promotion. Adaptive training became standard curriculum at all special operations schools. Military medical boards began evaluating personnel for adaptation potential rather than simply documenting limitations. Recruitment expanded to include candidates who brought unconventional perspectives to conventional challenges. 10 years after the drunk driver's truck had shattered her arm, Sarah received a letter from a young Marine who had been born with a congenital arm deficiency and had just graduated from force reconnaissance training using adaptive techniques. "Thank you for proving that different doesn't mean deficient," the Marine wrote. "Your example showed me that the things that make me different might be exactly what make me valuable." Sarah framed that letter and hung it in her Pentagon office, next to a photo from her original SEAL training and a picture of her wedding day. Together, they told the story of how breaking can become building, how limitation can become liberation, and how one person's refusal to accept impossible can change the world for everyone who comes after. The story that began with a shattered arm and a hospital bed had become something larger than personal triumph. It had become proof that human potential is limited only by human imagination, and that sometimes the most important victories are won not by overcoming our limitations, but by transforming them into our greatest strengths. In her final log entry as Director of Adaptive Training Development, before moving on to her Pentagon assignment, Sarah wrote words that will be quoted in military training manuals for generations. "We have learned that elite performance is not about perfection. It is about adaptation. The operators we send into the future will face challenges we cannot imagine, using capabilities we have not yet discovered. Our job is not to prepare them for the missions we know, but to prepare them to succeed at the missions we cannot yet envision." That preparation begins with understanding that what breaks us can also make us stronger if we have the courage to adapt rather than surrender. The drunk driver who had changed her life was never interviewed for this story. He served 18 months in prison and lost his license permanently. But in a strange way, his moment of devastating irresponsibility had created something profoundly positive that touched thousands of lives and changed an entire institution's understanding of human capability. Sarah never met him, never spoke to him, and never sought revenge or even acknowledgement. But sometimes, late at night in her Pentagon office, she wondered if Derek Hastings understood that his worst moment had somehow helped create countless people's best ones. That was perhaps the ultimate lesson in adaptation. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the foundation for the best things we do with the rest of our lives.